Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a major overhaul to Mexico's judiciary has just passed, despite massive protests.
Senators voted in favor of a constitutional reform under which Mexicans would elect judges at all levels of government by popular vote.
Will these reforms help fight corruption or make the country's problems worse? I'm Natasha del Toro, and this is The Take. This was a scene last week in Mexico's Senate chamber. Protesters stormed the chamber to try and stop a controversial law from passing. The law was pushed by outgoing President López Obrador and will remake the country's judiciary.
What we want to do is correct and disappear corruption. Above all, at the top level, judges and justices. Not all, but many of them, let organized crime figures and white-collar criminals go free.
Judges who were appointed will now be elected by popular vote. The change will affect all levels of the country's roughly 7,000 judges, from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court down to those at local courts, who will now be required to run for office. Joining me to talk about all this is Julia Galiano, a freelance journalist based in Mexico City. So, Julia, you've been seeing major protests happening. Maybe just really quickly, what's the scene on the ground? What's been happening?
Yeah, it's been a fairly tumultuous couple of weeks leading up to the approval and signature of this reform into law. Basically, this has been a reform championed by the president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He has been very, open about it, how important it is to him and to his government. It's been a debate very much divided along political lines. So, on one hand, he's had the majority in Congress and ultimately the Senate to pass the law. But the opposition has been very, very adamant about how strongly they feel that this is essentially the end of Mexican democracy. It's basically the biggest judicial overhaul in Mexican history.
And Julia, this is happening just as President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is leaving office this month. So maybe you can help us understand a little bit more about the timing here. Why did the government push this through now?
Mexico had elections in early June, and it was the biggest election in the country's history. For president, the current president's handpicked successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, won by a landslide. And he also got, his party, Morena, got a supermajority in Congress. So that new legislature took over just 2 weeks ago. And the moment it took over, it was very important for the president to start the debate and get this reform passed. This is a man who's very concerned with history and with his role in history. I mean, his whole movement is called the Fourth Transformation of Mexico, and the first three transformations are in reference to big moments in Mexican history, like the Mexican Revolution, Mexican independence. So for him, it was very important, I think, that this got approved under his presidency.
And so the fact that there are 7,000 judges now that are going to have to be elected, what's going to happen to the judges that are currently there who were appointed?
Well, they're essentially losing their jobs. It's not immediate. I mean, the first round of elections, they're not all being elected at the same time. The first round of elections is happening as soon as next year. But essentially, the judges now they're going to have to run for their jobs.
They'll need to raise money, make promises, all of which could compromise their independence. The reform also means significantly less experience and qualifications will be required of new judges.
Currently, there's a long process of tests and qualifications that lawyers need in order to become judges in Mexico, and they work their way up the judiciary for years and years before their names get sent to the Senate to be approved to become a judge or, are appointed by the president in the case of the Supreme Court. So this new reform would scratch all of that. And judges would have a very small list of qualifications, a small amount of experience, and obviously be a lawyer, have a law degree. And then they'd have to basically run a campaign. And the argument is that if you have to raise money for a campaign, if you have to basically become a politician, that also makes you susceptible to a lot of powers that judges should not be susceptible to.
What is the Mexican government hoping to achieve by pushing this major judicial overhaul through?
Basically, President Andrés López Obrador has said that the election of judges is the ultimate example of how democratic Mexico is. He's saying that by bringing that choice to the people, they will decide who their judges are. And he says there's no fairer system than that one. He says that this just makes sure that the people have control over all three branches of governments. They pick their representatives in parliament, in the Congress and Senate. They pick their president, and now they're also going to pick their judges.
Why are so many Mexicans concerned about the president's new judicial reforms? That's after the break. So, Julia, you're saying, this reform might not get to the root of the problem. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit more. Just how corrupt is the Mexican justice system?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's important to highlight the fact that everyone in Mexico, or just about everyone in Mexico, thinks there should be an overhaul to the judicial system. I mean, no one here thinks that things work perfectly and that they don't need any changing. In fact, even those who disagree with this reform, who say this is not the way to do it, would agree that some change needs to happen. I think living here, it becomes very clear just how little Mexicans trust their, the authorities, the judicial system, the criminal system. And, they often are victims of crimes and they tell you, it's really not worth even reporting this. And there could be a wide variety of reasons for that. A, because you don't think anything's going to happen and you don't think, why even bother going through the process. Two, because you're somehow scared that reporting a crime to authorities will make things worse for you. There's a widespread sense of distrust in authorities in this country. And almost, that's at every level. So, there's known collusion between organized crime and authorities and politicians. As an authority, if you don't work for organized crime, then you are probably going to be killed or your family is going to be killed. So this is also something that those who oppose this reform have pointed out. How can the country ensure that the campaigns of these judges won't be financed by organized crime? Will those campaigns be financed by drug cartels? Obviously, it's in their interest to have friendly judges in the courts. So another question that isn't answered.
And it's not just some of the people in Mexico that are worried. I mean, this new law is raising concerns in Washington with legal scholars and in the business community. Julia, can you help us understand what's really at stake here?
Well, obviously, not having an independent judiciary creates a lot of shakiness in the markets. In fact, I mean, even over the last month, the Mexican peso, which had been historically strong over the last few years, has gone from, has dropped significantly. And a lot of that is fueled by fears that somehow, the independence of the Mexican judiciary, which obviously makes a lot of decisions in relation to big companies and the free trade agreement that Mexico has with Canada and the U.S.
The U.S. and Canada, Mexico's primary trading partners, have warned that the reforms could harm investor confidence and threaten the country's legal framework.
The U.S. ambassador, who actually has a fairly good relationship with Mr. López Obrador, but he made some comments a few weeks ago saying that having a free and independent judiciary is key to any democracy. And the president did not like that. And he actually said he was putting relations with the U.S. on pause over those comments. So it has generated some tension, certainly in the business community as well, for fear that if the judges in the country are compromised, the interests that they represent will also be not necessarily those of, say, the business community.
I mean, this is a historic change to how the judiciary in Mexico works. So do you have any sort of final thoughts on, this particular moment and what this means?
As a journalist living in Mexico who covers so much of the violence and so much of the influence of organized crime in this country, I would say it is somewhat concerning to think that these, and again, I don't want to make it sound as though drug gangs and organized crime doesn't currently have an influence in the government and in the judiciary and essentially in every single branch of government. It does. But there is certainly a fear that being elected directly by popular vote and being so much more accessible to the people, that they can also be influenced by organized crime. I mean, I forget the exact number, but I think it's some 30% of towns in this country that are said to be controlled by organized crime. So that is certainly a concern. And I think it's probably the main concern of a lot of the people that we've spoken to here. But I think we just have to kind of wait and see how this plays out. The incoming president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has expressed complete support for this reform, but maybe she'll also have a different approach to governing, somewhat different to the current president, and that will make a difference once she's in power. I think you have to wait and see what happens once it actually starts being enacted.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Khaled Soltan, Chloe K. Lee, with Hagir Saleh, Duha Mosaad, Shraddha Joshi, Hisham Abu Salah, and me, Natasha Del Toro, in from Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Waz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.